Okay. So we'll talk through and this is a little bit of a rambling. The census has been with us for this since the founding of the country. And so therefore it's got many different iterations to what it's been. And we're going to sort of talk a little bit about the history of it and how it got what it is and what's going on. And then we're going to take some specific challenges and walk through that. And if at any point you've got a question, feel free. Okay, just interrupt. So this is actually the from the Constitution. So representative and taxes shall be apportioned to the states according to their respective numbers, determined by whole numbers of persons, including indentured servants kind of people, excluding Indians not taxed. Indians were typically believed to live in a different country if they were on a reservation. Therefore, they were not voters and they couldn't be taxed and they couldn't be counted. And three-fifths of all other persons. And we know what that means. That means three-fifths of slaves. Enumeration shall be made within 3 years and then within every subsequent term of 10 years. Theoretically, the Constitution does not say 10 years, it says within 10 years. So you could have a census after 5 years and meet that requirement. So this is sort of a rambling 1850 census. We'll talk our way through this later, but just typical handwritten, the information that was given being lined out. This one has good handwriting. I can read it. Not all of them do. It's also well reproduced. You'll find if you do the census that there are a number that aren't. By the way, Mary Clendenin is a great, great, great aunt of mine, down in line 6. So the numerators every year had a book of instructions, and I have put online a link to how to get to those books. A typical book would be like 50 or 60 pages because it really goes through in great detail what they were supposed to do. By the way, they were very well paid. So the starting point and the key point is that family in the census term simply means people who live in the same place. So if I've got a husband, wife, and 2 kids, that's a family. If I've got a husband, his sister, and a great, some sort of a servant, that's a family. Okay. So they're instructed, don't believe any statement you think might be false. In later censuses, particularly, it was important that if you needed a translator, you could deal with that. And the instructions were, we don't really want to pay for one. So therefore, start with maybe younger family members who can speak English, then try neighbors. And if you really have to, you can call your supervisor, and he has the authority to get you a translator. You'll find if you go through the census, different versions of this, but you want to separate townships if you're in a city, wards. So the city, particular ward, incorporated villages. In a city, if the houses are organized by block, you go around the block. You don't go up and down the street. You go around the block. And if you go from one block to the next block, you put a line in the left-hand column. So if you ever notice that, that's what that means. So here's 1900 compensation. They got counted 3 cents per person with the minimum pay of $4 per 10-hour day and a maximum of $6. 1900 average pay would have been $2.50 per 10-hour day. Okay, so that's a reasonably good compensation. And typically you wanted this is like in all politics, you wanted to be on the right side. Whoever was in power locally would dole this out. Okay, now as a genealogist, think about the following points as we go through. It doesn't matter how much you want to correct the census. It is what it is. What you actually want to do is record what it says. So if the spelling is garbage, that's fine. Write down the spelling the way that they have it. Don't try to correct them in your notes. Okay, that's very important. Um, the facts, age, whatever, that doesn't matter. Even if you think that they're absolutely crazy, that's okay. Write it down. Um, we'll look at this in a minute, but you want to record the information at the top, which is the information about where was it taken, who took it, every piece of information on there can turn out to be important. And in particular, you always want to be able to find where you got the information by going back. Members of the household are usually in birth sequence. So you usually have the eldest at the top going down, and that's important. A trick is if you're comfortable with what you're looking at, go back and forth a couple of pages and see what shows up. It's amazing the number of times something shows up that also links to your family. Another member of the family, maybe maybe you know that um, uh, you know that your ancestor's sister married into this family, and all of a sudden you go one page over and there they are. Okay, kind of thing. So, this is a quick look at the 1850 census. We're gonna tear this one apart because I think it's useful to get an idea of what the censuses were trying to do. So this is the header, and the headers are pretty much similar. Okay, there's a date of enumeration. The date of enumeration was the day that the census taker actually showed up at your house and took the information. But they were quite strict about this. The information was to be as of a given date. So I can, very real example, in 1910, the date was April 15th. And in fact, I had a great grandfather who died April 18th of 1910. The census was taken in his household on April 20th. So I know he's dead, but he's recorded in the census as being alive because on April 15th, he was alive. Now, it should be obvious, but if I take a census as of June 1st and I say someone is 20 years old, that could mean they were born at the end of 1829 or at the beginning of 1830. So age does not give you the exact year. It gives you typically a choice of 2 years. Okay, that clear? And all this is a copy of all this will be on the website if you ever need it. Okay, so the first thing we have is the head of the household. And that is the person who was responsible in principle for running the household. As I mentioned, I did have a great great grandmother, okay, who in 1870 was head of household because I didn't think I mentioned that. She was head of household because her spouse was demented. Okay, so he shows up at the end of the list. Children, eldest to youngest, then other members of the household. But repeating, because you're a member of the household doesn't mean that you were necessarily related. So if I had a farm and everybody lived in the farmhouse, and that included the two uh, indentured servants, okay, they would show up in there in that list. So then there would be personal information, age, sex, color, white, black, or mulatto. Mulatto being of mixed color. Um, Over the years, the mulatto thing shifted pretty radically. Okay. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but eventually it became one drop of blood, one drop of black blood, and you're mulatto. Okay. We'll talk why in a second. Um, but at this point, 1850, it would probably mean that you were at least an octoroon or higher, meaning 1/8 or more. Um, there's no space on here for Indian, but if you were an Indian who was not on a reservation and was in fact part of the society and taxed, uh, they would write IND or Indian in the column. I actually have a Cherokee ancestor who in the 1870 census in his particular county is the only one listed as an Indian. And I have his heritage, so I know he's correct. Married within the year, at school within the year, and people over 20 who cannot read and write. Now, in 1850, if you had looked at that page I had earlier, the two elder women both had a mark that said they could not read and write, but the younger ones could. Place of birth and origin. We'll get into this in a little more detail as we go on, but you name the state, the territory, or the country. In 1850, that was pretty loose. The country was just pretty much anything you said they'd write down. As you get in further into time, that gets more and more precise, again, according to particular rules. We have identification of people who have a problem: deaf, dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or convict. In some censuses, this is broken out in great detail as to, and quite often convicts were in a prison and they were listed in the prison page. Prison had its own page. Residents. This gets more and more complicated over time, but dwelling houses, let's just think about a tenement versus a farm. Okay. A tenement is a dwelling house that might have 3 families. Okay. So if you looked at the census for New York City, it might say this is dwelling number 1, family number 1, dwelling 1, family number 2, dwelling 1, family number 3, then dwelling 2, family number 4. Okay, so the number of the families goes down in sequence, the number of the dwellings. In a farm, it would be, going back to the one at the top, which is a farming county. Okay, you had the same number of dwellings as you had families. Okay, because that's just sort of the way it was. Then you have economic information. In this year, it was your profession or trade. Everybody on the page we looked at was a farmer, and value of real estate owned. I want to dwell on the profession for a second, particularly as we get into later years. Now let's talk about 1910, 20, 30. Okay. If you can get an occupation or trade, sometimes that is a key to identifying a person over time. Okay. Because you aren't going to suddenly jump from being a millwright, okay, to being a seamstress. You follow me? You pretty much same thing. So keep an eye on that. And then the value of real estate. That also becomes more complicated over time. And then from 1790 to 1860, we had information on slaves. So if you had family in the South, there would be the slave schedules for 1850 and 1860, which are separate schedules. They're not part of the census you normally look at. Name of the owner, number of slaves, age, sex, color. There's no names. Okay. You are able to get some delineation because they will list out slaves and age in some sequence. And in some censuses, they're actually in families. So you can actually see the emergence of a family. No names, but you can see the emergence of a family. So if you're doing, as I have done some research into slave ancestry. Okay, now we'll move to 1880. At this point, the census has had a major expansion, so has the country. Um, prior to 1880, 90% of the country was rural. It was gradually moving up. By 1880, it was 30% now living in an urban area. Um, so now we have the address that gives the street name and the number where appropriate. We add the place of birth of the father and mother, more detail, and that's where the term mulatto is any perceptible trace. That's a quote from the book. And then this lists the relationship. And to the extent that it is accurate, it'll go down to stepson, stepdaughter, whatever. Um, and it's obviously a lot busier. Okay, and here we have not only where you were born, but your father and mother. And this begins the move into understanding where people were born based on the geographic definitions at the date of the census. So you may have been born in Prussia, but if Germany now exists, the census will say Germany. Okay. And of course, the best example of that we'll get to in a second, but it's Eastern Europe where things get quite wild. And again, lots of information. And I think what I'd like to highlight is with a beginning in the 1870, 1880 censuses, you're beginning to get enough additional information. Don't ignore it. When you have check marks in those columns, there's meaning to them. Stop and think about what they mean. Okay. Okay. By the time we get to 1900, what's the big change in America? We are now heavily focused on immigration. We have a new immigration law. We have Ellis Island up and operating. We have all sorts of changes to the immigration structure. So now all of a sudden, the questions show up on immigration and naturalization. Native language shows up. So in addition to where were you born, where were your parents born, what language do you speak at home? Women, one I love, for women of childbearing age, how many children have you born and how many are still living? That is very helpful if it's accurate for sorting out families. If married, is this a second or later marriage? And in the 1910 specifically, if you're a veteran of the Civil War, okay, which is the last column over on the right. And that's what I mean. Don't ignore these because they can be quite powerful. And as I say, it becomes very busy. Take the time to go through it. 1940, where some of us are old enough to show up. We're now impacted by FDR and the Depression. Where were you living 5 years ago? Trying to get see, this is very political. We're trying to get a handle on how much movement there has had to be by people trying to find work and trying to find a living. Did you pay into Social Security? A lot of the more interesting information now is relegated to only two people per page. So if you're lucky enough to have one of the two, you get a bunch of additional, but otherwise you don't. So again, lots of stuff we could talk about. Residence April 1st, 1935. See how much space they've devoted to that? And then these are the supplementary questions for the two people who get it. And one filled out. Now, before 1850, it was different. We'll look at an example in a second. It was focused purely on sex, age, we separated white from colored and free from slave. Names of household with ages of those in the household grouped. So, for example, you'd have males under 10, 10 to 15, 16 to 18, 18 to 26. Okay. This becomes very valuable. And what I've had to discipline, because I have a lot of ancestry going back into that period, is you have to keep track of every person you believe would have shown up in that household. So if you know who the kids were, you can work it backwards and say, okay, if they were this age in 1850, what were they in 1840? What were they in 1830? And work backwards. A little known fact is the median age in America was 16.7 years in 1820. And it didn't change a lot over the next few years. So when you look at the focus for age, okay, keep that in mind. 90% of Americans lived in rural areas. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to get we're going to get into a slight diversion into how the census dealt with what do you do with people who aren't there. So there are different classifications. We'll talk about that actually, maybe even the next slide. Next slide. But let's ramble a minute. Okay. The instructions were quite clear. If you actually found an empty farm that the neighbors said that's not empty, they were all down at the market. Okay. You had to go back. Okay. That was part of what you get paid to do. So that's an important part of what you're doing. If there was a knowledgeable person who could fill you in on who all the family was, you'd accept what they told you. Okay. So you wouldn't take a 10-year-old, but you might take a 15-year-old, particularly in a world where 16 was pretty average. Um, the commonly, of course, in rural America, you would, if there was one, you would have had a female spouse at home who would have been around to answer those questions, usually. And the census takers usually were local. They usually knew the families. So it wasn't like they were going into some, hidden area that nobody had ever been in and trying to figure it out. But we're going to get to how to find your lost family in a minute. So this is the 1820 census, and you can see how it breaks out here age-wise, free white males, free white females, slaves, free colored persons. And then there are a few columns off to the left of the lower down area that deal with the number of people in different kinds of occupations. Um, so that's a lot of information. And this is how it usually shows up if you haven't had the pleasure of looking at it before. Excuse me. It could easily be a slog to work your way through one of these. And what I often recommend is if you can, and I have links to how to get to all of the blanks for each year. If you're doing 1820, be sure you have one of these around so you can look at what the heck that column right here means. Which column starts the women, because you're starting off with the men and then you get the women, and which means 0 to 10. Denise was kind enough to send me this. This is a chart that I've included into the website. that goes by year, and up and down what we've got is different questions, and by year, when did they show up? So if you have a question, you can do that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, so and a let's see, let's pick a specific line here for a second. Uh, okay, here's um, the month of birth last year is available in these two censuses. So if you were born in the last year, it actually gives the month of your birth in those two censuses. All right, let's tackle some problems that occur. One of them is this is all wonderful, but I've looked and looked and looked and I can't find my family. So the rough number is about 5% weren't counted in each census. You can argue, there's a whole bunch of arguments back and forth. Typically, big undercounts among blacks and renters or people who were itinerants as such, uh, or families in motion. I mean, if people were moving around, they were going west, trying to get some land. There was some fraction of people who were moving around that week. The biggest problem is how they deal with people who belong at the household but are away for a long time. So a typical would be what if your kid is at school in the county seat? And there the question is not only do you remember to count them, but where do you count them? Okay. So if I'm a traveling salesman, I have a home, and this week I'm going to be in Richmond. So I'm staying in a hotel in Richmond or a boarding house in Richmond. Okay. So the census taker comes to the boarding house. Does he count me there? Or does the guy at home count me? Okay. And they give instructions, but I'm sure that everybody will run into cases where they know that it's wrong. And I have one which is in the 1940 census, 30 census, 1930 census. My mother was one of four girls. Okay. And two of the girls are counted at home, and two are counted at a orphanage school where they attended. The problem is they counted the same two both places. So the other two don't show up anywhere, but altogether there are four. Okay. I have no idea why they counted them the way they did. So how do you deal with that? Obviously, the classic is you look at alternative spellings. Um, this is first and foremost a place you don't get to fall in love with your name. Search first names if there's any unique first names. Look at alternative locations. One of the things that you can do is if you have a record of the family and somewhere it says where each of the children was born, take a careful look because you may find that the second child was born in Virginia, even if everybody else was born in Kentucky. So maybe somewhere in here there was a move to Virginia that says, instead of do like I do, which is I keep searching the name and I only want to look in the state. I know everybody was in Kentucky. Okay. I need to look in Virginia because there was a kid born there. And other records might give you that suggestion. Um, you can also think about places of work. One of my grandsons has an ancestor who was from Wales, and he was a miner, immigrated to the U.S., ended up in the coal mines in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, okay, and then went out to South Dakota where he worked in the lead mines. Well, he wasn't the only one who was making that transition. What got confusing was when he moved from Pennsylvania to South Dakota, he left the rest of the family behind until he'd gotten settled, and then he brought everybody out, which meant there was a census in there where I could find the rest of the family. Dang, I couldn't find him until I figured it out. And obviously, a woman may be remarried under a different surname, and we remember that children may use their birth surname, their stepfather's surname. There are even cases where they will use their mother's maiden name. And if the mother's been married more than once, heaven knows what they use. Okay. This is a case, the question you had about, well, what do you do if, in fact, you don't have someone who knows everybody in the household well? It's a census taker. You can have a problem with a census taker asking somebody about everybody in the family, and they'll be inclined to say, well, they're my brothers and sisters. They were all born in Virginia. Okay. And those facts are not facts. And this is also where you search other relatives, siblings. Where are they? Because it's quite likely that you stay with the family. Okay. So it's certainly a good place to look. And not unknown when you start talking children that are 15, 16, 17, 18, that they may move and live with an aunt or uncle. Okay, so they'll show up in that household and with the same last name, just to confuse things. Okay, the next big challenge is how can we use this information to help us figure out the maiden names, marriages, children, all the information we can. The big home run is if you can find somebody listed in the same census or maybe even next door, and you say, voila, that person is probably her sister, or that person is maybe her mother. I mean, many times you'll get a census where there will be a woman at the very bottom of the census who is clearly somebody's mother, and she's not clearly the head of household's mother. Got it. Although you have to be careful. I've run into at least two cases where that person turned out to be remarried. So it was the right person, but the wrong last name. Review those who live nearby. Keep checking the same address. Okay. We had a case where we were tracking family in Lynn, Massachusetts, and by looking at the tenement house, we discovered what happened to one of the sisters, okay, who was still in the same house, but she married and had a completely different name. By the time we remembered her first name, what the house was, it was easy then to find marriage and determine what was going on. Most marriages occur near the bride's place of residence. And so as a result of that, take a look at where the woman says she was born. That's where you want to be looking to try to find the marriage. Okay. And sometimes you can find the husband living there before the marriage. After all, they had to meet some way. Or you can find somebody else with the husband's name, surname, living nearby. We turned up an unusual one. Basically, the grandfather of the man who married lived nearby, but with the same name. In this particular case, he happened to have the same first and last name. So it was surprisingly easy to tie them together. Hey, you've got all sorts of things. If you don't have the actual year of marriage, you can get the ages of the children. Okay. And while particularly in the 1800s, it was not uncommon for people to have children who were born only a few months after the technical marriage. Okay. You can get pretty close. So look at the ages of children. And then even going back well into the 1800s, you can try newspapers for marriages. Obviously, text searches. take a careful look at names. As you work your way back through the censuses, you'll be looking at names, and you can find the names that cluster together are your family. So my McKinneys are Williams and Johns, and but they're not Collins, and they're not the Scottish names that one might have expected. Um, Search by first name only, and you might do that combined with other information. Um, when you get to the years in which you actually have a street address, um, Family Search will let you search, including the street address. It's other things in the record. And do make sure you don't make a mistake about who's the mother. Okay, you have to remember that very few women over 42 and almost none over 45 have children. So if you're looking at if you work it backwards and the 60-year-old woman has an 8-year-old child, that's probably not her child. But sometimes you got to think about it. Any questions on that? All right, the last one I want to tackle. Diversion. The census has information about a person's place of birth and that of their parents. This is a place you want to look carefully at siblings. Okay? Because lots of things that are funny can appear. For example, you may have siblings whose mothers were born in different places. Okay? Which may be the only clue you've got to the fact that the father had two marriages. If people are born in the same foreign location, there's a good chance they married there or knew each other there and married here. Worth chasing that down. As we get further into the census records, we'll look at this in a minute, the name of the place of birth changes. And as that happens, it turns out in some cases that helps you narrow even further where they were likely born. Okay. To take a domestic example, since I've got a whole batch of folks out of West Virginia, okay, depending on whether you say you were born in Virginia or born in West Virginia, tells a lot about when you were born or when or where within Virginia you were born if you were born in Virginia. Okay. Where do people live? 1790 to 1860, 1850, you have the state, county, city. So it would say the city of Pearisburg, the county of Giles, in the state of Virginia. 1860 added the post office or ward, and wards can be quite valuable in understanding where your family lived and how to look for similars. So it would be Chicago Ward 9, Cook, Illinois. SteveMorris.org has a lot of helpful information on where city wards were. 1880, they added the street and the house number. 1900, they added the enumeration district. That was a description of the enumerator is the person being paid to take the census. So it tells you who was the host. And what I always love to do when I can is, this is actually from 1910, the 6 Prince Street. That's where my wife's grandfather lived, and that's where he lived. That's Google Maps. Okay, street view. This is the tenement. It's a 3-story tenement, and he housed it as he brought people over from Poland or Lithuania, actually. He housed his brothers and everybody else who came over in that house. Kind of fun. Okay, country of origin. So we talked a little bit about this before, but the terms used were based on the location's name at the time the census was taken. So the classic example is, of course, Eastern Europe, and I can use the example of Poland. If your ancestor was born in 1870 in what was then and is now Poland, they were born in Russia, or they were born in Germany, or they were born in Austria, because Poland was lots of little places. Okay. But by 1930, after World War I, when Poland was running as a country for a while, okay, they were instructed, now you simply say Poland. So you can't get the same clarification you could earlier. Now, there are a couple of areas. Czechoslovakia is one, Yugoslavia is another, uh, where it gets really hairy. And I would say if you've got ancestors from those areas, you want to probably look at the instructions, which have page after page of detail about how to tell, what to say. Okay. One big addition is in 1910 and 20, you have native language. That is helpful. Although it may show up as Yiddish, which doesn't help as much as it might in a different day. Date of immigration. The first place to start is what's the first census the person shows up at. If you've got someone who's 40 years old who shows up in the 1860 census for the first time, there's a pretty good chance they immigrated between 1850 and 1860. Okay, nothing you can guarantee, but that's a pretty good hint. 1900 to 1930, it actually lists a date of immigration. That one is wonderfully valuable, but don't consider it cast in stone. Okay, people would lie about that for a number of reasons. The biggest one being if they actually immigrated in 1908 and they had told people they immigrated in 1906, then they could become a citizen 2 years earlier, and that was a good thing. Okay, so lying about the year of immigration would typically you'd add a little early, make it a little earlier. Okay, naturalization. For most of history, you had two court documents, what's called a declaration of intent, called first papers, and an application for citizenship. Okay, the information in the first one is intended to verify when you came to this country. So you're going into the office and saying, the judge or whatever, and you're saying, I came to this country in 1906 on this ship on this date. And they would actually go back to Ellis Island, for example, and ask them to verify. So in 1908, that's what you did. Then in 1911, when you applied for citizenship, you didn't have to do that all over again. In 1908, you also would list your wife or your children, okay, who immigrated with you. Because prior to 1922, and of course 1922 happens to be coincident with the idea that women could now vote, okay, wives or simply became citizens when their husbands were naturalized. There was no independent process for them to be naturalized. Technically, they could be if their husband died. And prior to 1924, children became citizens when their fathers were naturalized. So, how do I know someone was naturalized? 1870 is fascinating. There is a place on the census for a male U.S. citizen with the right to vote. So if you're an immigrant and that's checked, that means that you're naturalized. Now, why does that appear in that one census and nowhere else? The answer was the Civil War. Because there were people in the South who were U.S. citizens who did not have the right to vote. That was still being processed. 1900 census, lists the AL for alien, PA for first papers, NA for naturalized, and the instructions remind you does not apply to foreign-born children or wives. 1920 adds the year of naturalization. 1930, now both wives and children may have to be separately naturalized. So there's a clarification that you now begin to put information in the columns for the wives and children. And 1940 is the same. They added an interesting AMSIT for a person who was an American citizen at birth but was born abroad. Just sort of, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, because they would become a citizen only when their father became a citizen or husband. So therefore, you're the census taker. Let's say you've got a household with husband, wife, and three kids, all born outside the U.S. Okay, husband, you'll put all that information down. You don't put the information down for the wife and the children because it's the same as the husband. Okay, that okay, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. So, do we have any questions? Roger, Karen, anybody here? You're on again. Grab the mic so we can share with Roger. I have to turn it on. There's a little switch there.
Yes, there is. Just a little interesting story on naturalization. Um, when my grandparents came, they had one child, which is actually it's my great grandparents changed. My grandmother comes. They've all been born in Italy. Uh, my great grandfather becomes a citizen, and so the wives and children follow. But they were very worried because they were afraid that if my grandmother, who had been born in Italy, married an Italian who wasn't a citizen, she would lose her citizenship. So, one of the big scandals in the family was that they forced my grandmother to marry an Italian man who had been born here in the US to ensure her citizenship.
Well, that's a modern story in many ways. Uh, yeah. Okay. I didn't mention it, but I think everybody knows the 1890 census was burned up. It was a fire. It was there weren't any extra copies, with the exception of a very few pages. Doesn't exist. So there are replica, not replica. There are faux censuses that have been put together. Okay, I think both for Family Search and Ancestry have one. They're based on directories. Okay, city directories, tax records. Okay, anything they can put together. But the common places you're looking, city directories is a good place. If you're in a city, everybody knows city directories. Okay, the very common in the actually really from the 1850s forward to have a city directory of all the people in a city, and it was basically you sold the directory to salespeople, so they would know who was around and where they lived and what they did. Um, Give a lot of information. More and more of them are coming online, so they're a great source. Okay, and typically you can look just before and just after if necessary, and say, okay, if I've got the family living here, then they're probably still there. Um, Tax records, and there are tax records. The but it's very much of a catch as catch can. And you have to look at the specifics. I don't know if that's helpful. Okay, any other? Okay, we're not having a meeting in November, and we're not having a meeting in December. In November, instead of the November meeting, I'm offering a class at the Computer Learning Center in early December that's designed for new researchers who want to sort of go through the process of putting together a family tree and understanding how to link the research to the tree. So it's not really meant for experienced researchers, but it is meant for relatively new. So if you're interested, you can email me or you can contact the Computer Learning Center. Okay, that's it for today.